Well, this is Dateline News and Conversation. It's June the 8th, 2026, and we're coming to you live from Yalta in the Crimea and from the state of Maine. But before I introduce my guest, um, I've been talking about this for the last 2 or 3 days that many people are feeling overwhelmed with the incredible amount of news, blogs, posts, videos about everything from the war in Iran to the war in Ukraine to what's happening across the EU. They're in recession. People are losing their jobs. The same thing is happening in the United States. And then people are having to deal with Donald Trump, his lies, his contradictions. And people are wondering, well, what can I do? I'm nobody. I'm only one person. We're going to get into that tonight in this show. One person can do a lot. 1,000 people can do more. Millions of people can do a lot more. And hundreds of millions of people around the world can do a lot. My guest tonight, she's an old friend, Lisa Savage. Lisa, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Regis. Thanks for having me.
Now, Lisa, before we get into your arrest at the Pentagon and why you go out several days a week, once a month, all over the state of Maine, different locations to protest or to have events where you bring your signs and you try to make people aware and educate people about everything that's going on. I want people to have a little bit of an idea of who you are first. Now, you and I go back, well, it's about a decade or more now. Tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what your education was like, and what you did for life as a career. So I'd like you to start with that. So take it away. The show is yours.
Thanks, Regis. Well, you said hi, Grandma, when I came on the video camera, because you know that I have grandchildren that I'm really, really interested in spending time with. And I'm lucky enough to be a retired school teacher now, so I have that kind of time. My childhood, I was born in Maine and lived here through going to kindergarten. Then my dad was from Maine, my mom was from California. So we moved to California for economic opportunity for my dad, who was the breadwinner of the family. And so I grew up in urban California. We lived in Los Angeles for many years. And then when I was 11, we moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. And I went to high school there. And then I came back to Maine to go to Bowdoin College for 4 years. That is a very small, very old, very elite sort of private college. A lot of CIA people get recruited from Bowdoin College. I wasn't really a good fit. You know, I was a scholarship student there. I did not make a lot of lasting friends from my time at Bowdoin because most of them were pretty wealthy and pretty determined to stay that way. And it just wasn't not my crowd. So I went back after Bowdoin to California for a bit, worked for the American Arbitration Association, where I was trained as a mediator and a negotiator, it turned out to be really important learning for later in life. I worked for them for a while. That had been my college job too. But then I fell in love, and my first husband proposed that we go traveling in Asia. We were both college graduates. We both wanted to have children, but we didn't have any yet. So I spent the next 4 years traveling around India at first, and then we went to Japan and lived in Tokyo for 4 years, from 1980 to 1984. Both my older children were born there. And that was a whole education. I just love learning. And, every bus ride I was, trying to decipher the advertisements and trying to learn to read Japanese, trying to learn to speak Japanese. And I didn't work much. I was a stay-at-home mom with 2 children, very close together. I did teach a little bit of English, and I did some freelance journalism writing for the English language, periodicals in Tokyo. Then we moved back to Los Angeles in 1984, and I got a job working in advertising agencies. The accounts that I worked on were always import cars. For a while, I worked for Nissan's ad agency, and then I worked for Hyundai's ad agency. And so I learned a lot about marketing, and I am a communications person. I had a journalism background in high school and college, so that was a good fit for me. However, when my dad died suddenly in 1988, I had the opportunity to come back to Maine and run the family business that he had abruptly departed from. It was a little pub in the hometown where he had grown up in Maine. And so I did that for 7 years. The school system was good in the town, and so I was happy to move my children there. And I was able to be really close to home when I was working and set my own schedule, and it was a good fit. And because I had that kind of flexibility, I started volunteering in the public schools that my kids went to. And that really appealed to me. And so after about 7 years of running a pub with my brother, I decided, I can't do this for the rest of my life. So I went back to college at the graduate level and got certified to be a teacher. And then I taught in public schools in some pretty poor parts of Maine for 25 years before retiring. I had a third child during those years, or right before I went back to school. And again, it was a good fit with being a mom. When he was really young, I took him to school with me. So he went to the school where I taught. I had the same holidays my children had. When your child is sick and you tell your boss in an advertising agency that, they don't care. In fact, you're better off to pretend you don't have children if you work for, American capitalism. But a school district is much more family oriented, and they would understand that, like, if you have a sick kid, that's your top priority. So that was a good fit. It gave me the time to start doing some organizing. I learned organizing from someone who was trying to resist all of the teachers in Maine having to put their fingerprints in the FBI database to prove that we were not child molesters. As we now know, there were plenty of child molesters out there, really rich guys using every trick in the book to get away with it. But I objected on the grounds like no one's accused me of being a child molester, and the people that are molesting children in schools are usually allowed to resign and slip away quietly under cover of darkness. They never get tried, convicted, and their fingerprints aren't in the FBI's database. Again, as we have seen with who's been prosecuted for the Epstein files exactly since the release of the Epstein files. Nobody. That's who. That's how the justice system works here. Anyway, long story short, I learned political organizing from that. I had always been against the Vietnam War when I was a kid, against the horrible, horrible wars in Central America under Ronald Reagan. But I was a pretty busy mom, full-time job, raising kids. And so it wasn't until my youngest child was, pretty independent that I began to get really involved with anti-war organizing. At the right before the U.S. attacked Iraq, I stood on a bridge in a nearby town and for a candlelight vigil right before shock and awe happened, and that is where I met my husband, Mark Roman, who I'm married to today. And he and I have been partners in this work ever since that day. I think we both felt like, wow, something really good happened when I went to that bridge. So I need to keep on doing that. We have met the nicest people and become really good friends with some wonderful, wonderful folks through doing this protest work, resistance to the U.S. imperial wars. And so now I, live in the country and grow vegetables in the summertime and spend as much time as I can with my grandkids, because boy, do they grow up fast. And they know about the stuff I do. When we got arrested at the Pentagon back in March, I let my son I have one of my sons lives here in Maine, know what we had been up to. And he said, we are so proud of you, and make sure you tell his 8-year-old daughter about it, because she will want to know about it. So my grandchildren are always telling their teachers and rec department coaches and stuff about my anti-war work. And so I'm glad that they're proud, and I'm glad that they're seeing that dissent is possible. I've always said my favorite audience when I am standing on the pavement thinking about the government, and I've got a sign and a bunch of people are standing with me, when a car goes by with a child in the back seat and their mouth is opening, they're about to go, Mom, what are those people doing? I love that audience, because even if mom says we're a bunch of idiots or whatever mom and dad say, it really doesn't matter, because the child has noticed that someone's dissenting and sees that it's possible, and the question has been asked. Maybe a good conversation happens in the car after that. There were children in the audience when we were arrested at the Pentagon, as a matter of fact, and that made me feel good, because I'm sure that those parents that were taking their children to visit the Pentagon had some explaining to do about why were 27 people singing. Many of them were praying. And then there were about another 30 people standing in support with us, but they were not protesting or risking arrest. So it was a good sized crowd. We didn't block any entrances. We didn't prevent anybody from going about their business, although the charges claimed that we had blocked the subway exit. That was absolutely not true. And you can see in the video that we didn't. So, over my lifetime, I'm about to turn 70. The control of information about what your government is up to has been pretty extreme. Even when brand new ways of communicating get invented, like the internet or social media or cell phones that you can communicate with, the algorithms and the sensors and the invisible hand of the empire is always there, squelching information about real people caring and uplifting information about capitalism, how glorious it is, or there's lots and lots of propaganda here about service members, people that are in the military, veterans of the military. And Mark and I were just watching dumb TV last night because we were too tired to do much else, watching Netflix. And, the show was 100% designed to sell the notion that people in the military are making this huge sacrifice, and all the rest of us need to sacrifice for them. And there's this whole ethos that the U.S. really, really pushes, but it doesn't really work anymore. Like, most people in the U.S. don't feel that way anymore. And the people that go to occupy and terrorize a foreign country often come back badly traumatized by it, and they never really recover from the injury to their conscience that participating in that kind of imperial wars for conquest meant. We're always taught that supposedly they're fighting for our freedom, and then you go protest at the Pentagon, you're not bothering anybody, you're totally nonviolent, and you get arrested. Like, what are these freedoms that supposedly are the U.S. military fights for? You can't even hold a sign outside the war machine. So I just like calling attention to those inconsistencies and contradictions in the hope that younger generations will continue to question and, not be I notice you have your little logo of a frog in a pot of hot water, and the old metaphor is that they turn the heat up very, very slowly on the water, so the frog doesn't realize that it's being boiled to death. I think the American people are basically that frog at this point in history.
If you notice, that little frog is part of my logo. It's been up there for several years. Anyway, I'm not going to let you get away with about something else that you did that was so courageous and so important. You ran for the United States Senate.
I did.
Against the Iron Maiden, Susan Collins, who's still there.
I did.
You avoided that one, but what?
As you can see, it wasn't a huge event in my life. My family and.
Well, I thought it was I thought it was a huge event. Uh, maybe not in your, well, in terms of the public and what you did and the attention that you got. Uh, Here's this little old grandmother, a retired school teacher, a troublemaker, running to try to remove Susan Collins from the Senate in Maine. Just briefly go over that. What, what, what got into you?
Well, part of it is it's a team effort, Regis. The candidate is just the celebrity spokesperson, if you will, for the campaign. But there are a huge number of people behind that candidate making it happen. And I was lucky to be able to build a good team. I was persuaded to run by Jill Stein, Dr. Jill Stein of the Green Party. I am a Green and I was a Green. And she called me on the phone and said, we really think that a Green candidate running against Susan Collins in 2020 could really be a winner. The Green Party's behind you. Would you consider it? And so I thought about it. And then Regis, our mutual good friend, Bruce Gagnon, that you've had on your show many times, also, persuaded me saying, oh, I'll be in, I'll help you out. I'll do everything that we need to do. It'll be so fun, he said. We'll have so much fun. It wasn't Bruce's first time being involved in a congressional campaign. At the time, I was still a full-time school teacher. Then the pandemic sort of ended my job, but not my paycheck for the rest of that school year. Once I got my name on the ballot, I did retire a year earlier than I had planned because it was a full-time job. It was very expensive. My family couldn't really afford that outlay of expense, but here we are. And but I was forced to unenroll from the Green Party because you cannot get on the ballot in the state of Maine and most states in the US if you are a third-party candidate. The two big corporate parties have rigged the rules long since. So I did have to become like an independent to get my name on the ballot, and then it was super easy. But we got 5% of the vote. I had an amazing communications person that essentially kind of was the campaign manager de facto for a while until we raised enough money to hire a campaign manager. And he was amazing. And I learned a lot from him. And he really got us the media attention. This was someone that had worked in media for many years, even in Europe and Maine. And so he really knew what reporters needed to get interested in a candidate, and he knew how to get me interviews. And I just said yes to everything. So I'd be there way past my bedtime on a Zoom call because it was during the pandemic, being interviewed by this or that alternate journalist, usually not mainstream, but most of the mainstream media in Maine did cover our campaign. So we got 5% of the vote. That's not bad for an independent candidate. My purpose was not to go to Washington and see Susan Collins. It seemed to me highly unlikely that would happen. My purpose was to have the amazing, as a communicator, the platform is raised, like 100 feet when you become a candidate. So I was especially interested in doing the debates. There were 5 debates. I was blocked from the final one, but the previous 4 debates, I got to talk about the things that never get talked about in U.S. Senate debates. They very seldom bring up foreign policy, which the Senate is supposed to oversee. And it was an opportunity to speak directly to the people through mass media and bring up some problems that are, chronic, and why we don't have healthcare and we don't have universal healthcare. Many people are living out on the sidewalk. Lots of children living in poverty, going to bed hungry at night. Yet we can spend $1 trillion on the Pentagon budget last year, and now they're asking for $1.5 trillion. That's $500 billion for next year's Pentagon budget. These things are deeply connected, but again, the censorship regime in this country makes sure that those dots are never in the same room together, much less connected. So it was an exciting time. I learned a lot. It was exhausting and too expensive. I would not be able to do that again.
Okay, well, I'm glad that we got to introduce that, because personally I felt that was very important, and I did get to interview you very early on in the campaign, and then I was no longer in the country. So I really lost contact with it. Well, I didn't lose complete contact because I kept getting reports and videos. So I was very proud of you for doing that. And
Thank you.
it get back to my introduction, and we're going to continue talking about this. What can I do? I'm really nobody. They're not going to listen to me. And I think what I wanted to bring out, and I hope that I did, is that you were this very little person who happened to have a really good education, but you were in a very small rural state of Maine, raising a family, teaching in a very poor district, but aware of all of these things that were so wrong, that were so harmful to people, not only in the state of Maine, where, by the way, I grew up, but all over the country and all over the world. And you, out of the state of Maine, I could say out of nowhere, all of a sudden was making some noise and showing other people that what one person could do, even rise so high as to challenge Susan Collins for the Senate in the state of Maine. That is no small achievement. And now I want to kind of segue, Lisa. You mentioned a lot of things in the last few minutes that motivated you. You talked about why you did the things that you did, hoping to create conversation, hoping to educate people. Now, I think the thing I want to focus on now, and then we'll kind of go in reverse to other protests that you've been involved in, not just once in a while, but consistently. You went down to the Pentagon, to Washington, D.C., with your husband, Mark, with Bruce Gagnon and his wife, Mary Beth Sullivan, to join, well, I guess it was 23 other people, because your group was 27.
Correct.
That protested at the Pentagon.
Correct.
What, I get back to the same question before, what got into you? What made you think, come on now, traveling from Maine all the way down, it must have taken you at least a full day to get down there.
It does, yeah.
What got into you to think that, Lisa, you could make any kind of a difference by going down to the Pentagon? And then I want to know, what did you do to get arrested? And then we'll continue with that story.
Okay. Why did I think I could make any difference? Well, being a teacher for all those years, that's an act of faith. You really hardly ever find out what the outcome was of you being involved in someone's education. Every once in a while, the nurse of in my doctor's office is going to go, oh, Miss Savage, is that you? And I'm going to look at their name tag and go, oh my gosh, is that you? And they've changed their name. And of course, they look completely different. And they'll say, oh, I became a nurse because, in your 5th grade class, you really told us women could be in the health services or whatever it was. And, this is like somebody from the first class I ever taught. You very seldom get that kind of feedback. It's just random, and years could go by without ever knowing what kind of effect, if you had a positive effect on opening people's minds, helping them to understand critical thinking and creative problem solving and courage, examples of courage. One example of courage that I used to teach is Margaret Chase Smith was a senator from my dad's hometown. In fact, went to high school with my grandfather. And she was famous for standing up to Joe McCarthy and his communist witch hunts in the Senate as a first-year senator. She'd already been in the House, but she gave a famous speech, the Declaration of Conscience, where she said, if our American freedoms don't mean that we have the freedom to criticize or to hold unpopular ideas, then what the heck, what freedom are we talking about? She too was a tiny little lady and from a very small town in Maine, but she made a difference, and words are still studied today. The reason that we specifically went down in March is that Bruce is friends with a man named Patrick O'Neill, who is part of the Catholic Worker Movement. Catholic Worker Movement are very radical Catholic people that grew up Catholic and then realized, like, we need to follow the teachings of Jesus Christ or we're not good Christians. So they do things like offer housing to the unhoused, feed the hungry, protest the war machine that's sucking up all the money that doesn't house and feed people that need it. And they have several centers around the country, but they have one in particular in Washington, D.C. called the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker House. Dorothy Day was a famous sort of early social work leader in the U.S. And so Bruce was invited by Patrick O'Neill because it was going to be Patrick's 70th birthday. And he said, what I want to do to celebrate my 70th birthday is go protest at the Pentagon in front of the entrance with as many people as will join me. So Bruce proposed to Mark and I and Mary Beth that we all go down. We actually combined that trip with a little side trip to Baltimore to visit with some other friends that are very active that used to live in Maine. Ken Jones and Melody Shank were now live in North Carolina, but they're super active in the Resist Raytheon. They've been to the West Bank this year. They've been to Cuba this year. And so we were going to have a little visit with them afterwards. So we often combine some socializing. I mean, really, this is my social life at this point. Mark and I really don't have a social life other than political action, the people that we do that with, and then our family. And I'm happy that way. It's great. So the Catholic workers have been a steady presence at the Pentagon. Usually they go on Fridays, I believe, for decades. The Pentagon has over time pushed them away from the building itself and pushed them down into they created a free speech zone. That's an oxymoron if I ever heard one. And it's basically like a dog pen that's on this strip of grassy lawn that's kind of really far away from the Pentagon's entrances or exits. And even that wasn't far enough. So now they've pushed them literally off the property across the street where they stand kind of under an overpass to protest. But Patrick wanted to go right up to the visitor entrance, not to block it, but for the audience, this is a witness of nonviolence and objection to the violence perpetrated by our government. And they wanted people going to visit the Pentagon to see that. So 27 of us had. One of the triggers for getting arrested at the Pentagon is holding signs with any kind of message on it. That has long since been forbidden. And if you do it, you'll get arrested. So people knew that was asking for arrest, but we had some banners and signs that were sort of concealed until we got there. And then, essentially we stood in a place where the metro, that's the subway of Washington, D.C., lets out as a Pentagon exit. So we were standing near there, not blocking it. And we were also standing near where people line up. There's the queue to get into the Pentagon visitor entrance. That's where I saw the children. There was a very military-looking dad with two young boys, probably about 9 years old. They looked like they might be twins. He was definitely going to be answering some questions later in the day based on the body language of these two boys that were with him. And, one of the Catholic workers led us in singing hymns. And then the Pentagon police, it's a special security force for the Pentagon, told us that if we didn't stop singing and put our signs away and leave, we were going to get arrested. We stayed. We were probably standing there for, 45 minutes or so, maybe 40 minutes. And then they began arresting us. Everybody went peacefully. They zip tied our hands behind our back. And they really weren't expecting 27 people. That much was clear. They didn't have enough vehicles to transport us to the place where they were going to process the arrest. So it took quite a while for the Pentagon police to get their act together. It became evident as we were being processed, which took like 5 hours for just to fill out a little thing saying, here you have a ticket, come back to court. But they were training a bunch of Pentagon police that were new on the job. So I think that we were the guinea pigs for that. And again, the Catholic workers would be always very compassionate toward others, including others that have made the mistake of taking a job being the Pentagon police. So it's quite a different experience to protest with them. When I protest with younger, more left-wing, even anarchist, Antifa types, they're much more hostile toward any authority figure, and in some cases will, say and do things that escalate the likelihood of violence. And this crowd was exactly the opposite. They were constantly de-escalating, talking to the Pentagon police, listening to them, asking them questions. There were a handful of young people with us. There was a very nice young man who grew up Mennonite, another Christian tradition of nonviolence, and he, I think, works with children in the DC area. And then there were 2 Fordham University students who were about to graduate, get their degrees, but they had come from, I think Fordham's in New York or New Jersey. I think it's in New York. They had come from Fordham to be with us. And, but the rest of us were mostly a bunch of gray-haired, grandparents.
So, Lisa, let me jump in and ask you something which I think for most people is hard to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you go down there knowing and intending to get arrested? I mean, it's one thing, I think, to go and protest, and a lot of cars drive by, a lot of people, but why get arrested? I think people need to understand why you do that.
It's a good question. It's a good question. In the old days, if we got arrested, you'd get media coverage. I kept saying, where's the Washington Post? 27 people are being arrested at the Pentagon. There's no reporter here, no TV, no. That's a big change over the last 10 years or so. But I think that the Catholic workers knew they're not getting any media attention, not any corporate media attention. It's partly because in the tradition of so much civil disobedience that has changed things for the better that I'm aware of because I've read about it and studied it, I'm jumping ahead, but the judge who heard he didn't hear our case because it was dismissed, but he gave the example like there's one way for you to have a voice in changing U.S. government, and that is to vote. And I mean, luckily I was in court. I would have laughed out loud. Yeah, I can see you're laughing out loud. And he was a Black man. So again, I used my, powers of filtering what I feel like saying to not yell civil rights movement. And was that accomplished by voting, buddy? Again, in court, I keep my mouth shut, whatever. But the purpose that the Catholic workers are looking for is they want a jury trial. And they want a jury trial because they would like to make an argument, 2 different legal arguments they're interested in making. One is the necessity defense, which is essentially, I was there to stop a much more important and dangerous harm, which is the Pentagon bombing Iran. And the amount of harm that I did was nothing, but it was necessary to try and stop this much greater harm. So that's the necessity defense. The Catholic workers are also really interested in making a religious defense because there has been some precedent in recent years that they could say, my faith compels me to object to my tax dollars being spent on killing people. It is absolutely part of the teachings of Jesus Christ that I must do this. So they're hoping to get a jury trial. Now, it was only a misdemeanor, so at best we were only ever probably going to get a magistrate trial. You're not getting a jury in there for a bunch of people holding signs. But they, in the event, they made us come. We filed a motion. I think there was an error in that motion, but anyway, we filed a motion to say, can the people who don't live in the area not have to come back and appear on June 4th? And that was just ignored. The court never replied to that at all. But the prosecutor, really, the police aren't in charge. The police write you up. But what happens in court is up to the prosecutor and the judge. It's not, the police are, but at that thing, it's out of their hands. What they wrote on the ticket may not even come up in court. But a sad thing that happened in the interim between Patrick's birthday and our court date is that Patrick had a stroke, a rather serious stroke. He did survive it, but he's in rehab, and his wife and one of their adult daughters were also arrested with us. And so the prosecutor had already dropped charges for Patrick, his wife Mary, and their daughter Bernadette in light of the medical crisis that the family was experiencing. So I wasn't terribly surprised that the prosecutor just declined to prosecute, essentially said, the government says dismiss the charges. But that was a very long trip. For me and Mark, where we live, is basically 1,200 miles round trip to be told, oh, those charges are dismissed.
Okay, so Lisa, you wrote in your blog, which inspired me to contact you to talk about this. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about the judge. You mentioned that he was sort of condescending. You didn't mention in your blog, did you just say he was a black man?
He was a black man. His name's Ivan Davis.
Okay, the stage is yours. Tell me what happened in court and how he behaved.
Yeah, I don't think the fact that he was black was particularly significant, except that when he said that about voting, I felt like going, dude, there's no civil rights. The civil rights movement did not accomplish any of this through voting. But I say he was condescending, and I don't mean to me, I actually never spoke to him directly, but he was condescending to everybody who came before him. He was condescending to the first prosecutor that was bumbling her way through a bunch of traffic court stuff. He was condescending to most of the defendants that were in court for speeding. And then he was definitely very condescending to the Catholic workers who did try to speak up and tried to plead not guilty, but if the charges are being dismissed, there is no plea. You don't plead guilty, nolo contendere, or not guilty. You just, charges are gone, nothing to plead to. He really liked lecturing, like saying these just, completely cliches, like as I tell my daughter, everyone has choices and choices have consequences. Like, what are we in fucking 7th grade? Buddy, I don't think your daughter probably appreciates this line of admonishment either, but whatever. He said some of the other silly stuff that he said. He lectured us on the separation of church and state. Oh, no, sorry. He lectured us on the separation of the 3 branches of the federal government, the executive, which the Pentagon is under, the judicial, which he is a judge in, and legislative, he didn't really wade into much. But again, like, we all took civics in 8th grade, sir. We have a better grasp of the balance of power, not the de jure balance of power, but the de facto balance of power in this country than he appeared to. Obviously, the big weapons manufacturers are the ones that run the show. They don't care if they win a war. They just want to make money. They could win, they could lose. As long as they sell their goods to us, then they have, they get richer. I don't know if he doesn't grasp his own role or his own form of government, or this is the act that he needs to put on while he's donning the robes. No one was really disrespectful. He interrupted and talked over people constantly, but one of the Catholic workers who tried to, sort of reply by insisting and going on with what he was trying to say, got lectured about being disrespectful, that he wasn't respecting the judge because he had interrupted the judge, but the judge had interrupted him in the first place. Anyway, long story short, we had our charges dismissed, but the comical part really of the whole thing was the prosecutor had told us before we entered the court that the Pentagon police had showed up with a no trespass order, a written no trespass order that they were going to serve each of us with, and they wanted us each to sign it. Well, in this crowd, of course, immediately someone said, well, what if I don't sign it? Then what? is going to happen. Prosecutor was like, I don't really know. I don't think they can compel you to sign it. It's not my order. It has nothing really to do with this court. I'm just giving you the heads up. So indeed, we went into court. The Pentagon police sat in the back row, but never participated in our non-trial. The judge never in any way alluded to these no trespass orders that we, in fact, he kept making a point of saying, I don't have any jurisdiction over the Pentagon. I can't rule anything about the Pentagon. I'm just here to talk about your misdemeanor offense. So when we all got up to leave the courtroom, the Pentagon police had stationed themselves outside the courtroom door with a manila envelope. I think it was full of these written no trespass orders. And we just didn't talk to them or take one. Everyone just kind of walked by them and exited the court. I was one of the first people out, so I didn't see everything that happened behind, but I would imagine that they got in trouble with their boss, Pentagon police supervisor, who probably said, what do you mean you didn't even give them out? And they're like, they wouldn't take them. You were supposed to get them all signed. They wouldn't sign it. So it reminded me a lot of being in situations like school where the authority figures try to make you think that something really terrible is going to happen if you don't do what they say. But a lot of times they're wrong. They're standing on shaky ground. And if you just don't do what they say, nothing actually comes of it.
Lisa, it's making me laugh. How ridiculous, really, if this could have been on television, how ridiculous the system looks and how it really has failed the people. Anyway, I love what you did. I of course, I completely understand what it's all about. You mentioned, you're protesting a $1.5 trillion war budget that's used not to protect American freedom and democracy. It's not about spreading freedom and democracy around the world. Anybody with half a brain or an eye open, watching even the news, knows that it's been about killing massive numbers of innocent people. We're seeing it right now, today,
yes,
in Israel and Iran, the United States behind it. Without the United States funding Israel to whatever it is, $30 billion a year plus, none of this genocide would be happening. Lisa, it makes me angry as someone born in the United States that not enough people are speaking out, Lisa, like you and your colleagues, our friend Bruce Gagnon, and so many others that we know, that others are either afraid of speaking out because are you still with me?
I'm with you.
Did you detect that interruption we just had?
Yes.
I can't tell you. It's been happening too frequently to me. And
I'm sorry.
I happen to think that it's not accidental. Anyway, I was on a bit of a rant about your courageous actions of protesting against the war machine, against the War Department, appropriately named, that is involved in killing millions and millions of people around the world. They've been doing that now for the last 10 or 12 years where I live. I'm living in Crimea. Uh, this war has taken God knows how many innocent people's lives on both sides. And it's the United States War Department that's behind it all. And it infuriates me. And, I'm not there anymore to be with you and to document all of the protests, all of the trials that many of you have been to in the state of Maine. But, I raised the question again. What can little people do? And you're a perfect example of that. I try to be an example of that by what I do as a filmmaker, as a blogger. Right. And, I'm proudly wearing this shirt that someone gave me of the United States flag with 2 boot prints on it. It's not my government. It's not your government. And it hasn't been. And it's so important for little people like us to do what we can to educate others. And as you said, you never know where that seed is going to grow and where it's going to go. Now, before we finish tonight, Lisa, I've got to ask you a few more questions. And I loved how you put it. You said, you and Mark, another one of my dear friends, don't have a social life. In fact, your social life is protesting. It's going around the state of Maine on a regular basis with your signs, trying to create discussion, trying to make people stop and think for a minute. I'd like you to explain for our audience your weekly and sometimes daily activities that you've been conducting with our dear friend Bruce, Mary Beth, and others around the state of Maine. What are you really hoping to accomplish? And, when you mention your social life, you're with people and you've known for a while, and then you're always meeting new people who join you. And there's a special bond that's created. Describe what happens at these protests and what happens immediately afterwards.
Well, the monthly statewide coalition protests, we try to go to a big intersection, like the most traffic in different parts of Maine. So we don't go to the same place over and over. And last week we were in Norway, Maine, which is pretty remote, pretty rural. It's in the mountains, just about southwest Maine, about on the New Hampshire border. And we stood with an old friend of ours, a retired pediatrician who had organized several local people to come. His focus, Tom Whitney's focus, has been Cuba for many years. And so he had some local contacts, local folks that were interested in that. And then we had the usual people that are willing to drive 2 hours to get to a protest. And we had some young people from the Green Party that we're close to. And I met a lot of new people. There was a guy, I posted a picture of him in my blog. Tim showed up in full, I wanted to say Scottish, but when I really looked at it afterwards, I realized he wasn't wearing like a plaid kilt, but he was wearing a kilt. He was in full kind of Celtic regalia with a keffiyeh around his neck for the Palestinians, which was a great look. He had the top hat and the whole, the thing across his front. And he was wearing a t-shirt that wasn't super visible, but I realized again, looking at the photo later, it said Dropkick Murphys, which is an Irish-American band that created a lot of controversy because they were projecting Epstein files, literally the Epstein files, behind them at a concert that they gave. So it's always an eclectic group of characters. People are there for various motivations, and we don't censor the messages at all. So the messaging could be all over the place. I happened last week to be holding a sign that said, "Don't bomb Iran, end sanctions." And I was standing on a traffic island where vehicles had to stop for a red light. And a woman in the front stopped vehicle with her window down says, we have to kill them all before they come over here and kill us. And my typical response to such people, because I'd like to have a dialogue with them, is, where do you get your information, ma'am? Because I'm curious, are they talking Fox News? Who are they? Well, I certainly don't watch the news, she says. So I'm like, okay, well, where do you get your information? She said, the Bible, you should read it. I said, oh, I have read the Bible, ma'am, a couple times. I think it says, thou shalt not kill. No, it says if you don't stand with Israel, you will be cursed.
Ooh.
And I said, Jesus never says that in the Bible. I believe he does say, turn the other cheek. And at that, she opened her mouth to reply, but her dentures came loose and kind of fell out of place, which stopped her from being able to speak. And then the light changed green. And so I don't know I'll never know what she was going to say next. But we do travel around the state. So sometimes we're in more liberal parts of the state. Really, the liberal Democrats don't like us either. They're all gung-ho about, that judge, I'll guarantee you, was a liberal Democrat, because their whole bullshit line is, voting. We'll just vote harder. That'll fix all this problem.
So, Lisa, what I'm doing is I'm scrolling across the bottom of the screen. The address to your blog went to the bridge at Substack. I really, before we finished, and I'm not finished with you yet, I want to make sure that people realize that you write a daily blog on Substack, went to the bridge.
And it's free. I do not charge for subscriptions. I hope I never have to.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Never charged anything for anything I've ever done, and will never get behind a paywall. So I want to encourage everybody to subscribe to Lisa's blog. It's not only informative, sometimes it'll make you laugh. So, Lisa, I want to thank you for that. Now, before we're done, I have a couple of more questions. Mm-hmm. Went to the bridge. I mean, that's kind of a weird name for a blog. How did you come up with that?
So I told you I met my husband, Mark Roman, on the bridge in our nearby town. And we went to that bridge every Sunday for years, protesting the Iraq War, the resurgence of the Afghanistan War, and all sorts of other bad things that were going on. It was a regular practice that just kind of got into my head. So actually, at one point, I wrote a novel, like the draft of a novel, about going to the bridge. And I used that phrase, went to the bridge, as kind of a recurring motif. So then when I started blogging, I thought went to the bridge would be a good title for me writing about. I've very often written about the things that people say or sometimes throw at us. Mark and I once had a cheeseburger thrown at us. And we also had, early in the Iraq War, a guy drove by and said, I'm going to buy you one-way tickets to France, because France was not being in the coalition of the willing at that point. Remember, they had renamed French fries Freedom Fries in the congressional cafeteria. That obviously Mark and I were kind of like, wow, that's the meanest thing anybody's ever offered to do for me. People get a little crazy. I used to hold a sign that said, who would Jesus bomb? Because the church where I was, christened as a baby infant is right next to this bridge, and people are getting out of church right around noon when we would stand there on Sundays. And I thought, for the audience, that was probably a good message. But that slogan made people dangerously angry. So many people got really, really bent out of shape or would stop in the middle of traffic. I was eventually convinced that if there's ever any violence on the bridge or a traffic accident, it's going to be because of this sign. So I stopped carrying that sign and changed my messaging a little bit. People really experience a lot of cognitive dissonance who think they are Christians, but then are confronted with, but you're not following the teachings of the Christian faith. So the bridge was a formative experience for me and for my relationship, for my marriage, really. It was, a super important thing that we did together.
I appreciate you sharing that. I have a personal story that is really quite painful. Um, my own children uh, have really not accepted me. Um, they think that because I have protested against their government, two of my sons were in the United States Army, and personally, I don't know how that happened. I never judged them for the decision to join. I understood it was an economic draft, um, but when you take stands like this, it can be very painful, and it can result in the loss of friends and family. Uh, when you stand up for the truth, that's a very painful thing to do, and at times it feels like a voice crying out in the desert. That you're alone and there's nobody listening. Um, but that's the price you pay for speaking out against the government, for speaking out against the establishment, as you've been doing for so many years. Now, I want to have one final question, um, and I know the answer to this, and you've already sort of talked about it. Years ago, you were protesting against Vietnam. You were involved in the civil rights movement. You protested against the United States 20 years in Afghanistan. You protested against the wars, both wars against Iraq. You protested against the war in Iran. But you mentioned something that sometimes people show up with signs with different things. Um, so, on the one hand, it's not consistent. But on the other hand, it is consistent because really what is at the bottom of it all, the thing that connects it all, is the evil acts of the government in all of these areas. Can you finish with that thought?
Sure. Well, our organizing slogan this past weekend was "No More Wars for Empire." Certainly, there are lots of people who are speaking up and taking very risky actions to push back against the fascism here at home with the ICE kidnapping people, keeping them in concentration camps. And that is really happening here. And I've been involved in that sometimes on and off. I'm not old enough to have been involved in the civil rights movement. I did teach the civil rights movement quite a bit and have tried to be an ally to people whose civil rights are still not being honored. But I think that, most people don't feel comfortable critiquing the US on the grounds of foreign policy. They can see that ICE and the way we are treating immigrants is horrible, and they can see that, and it's right there. Foreign policy is intimidating to many people. They feel like, I don't really understand what's going on. I don't have any reliable sources of good information. And constantly being brainwashed that, what, are you not patriotic? Well, of course, people that do what I do would argue I'm more patriotic than people marching off to war without even questioning whether this is an okay idea or not. But in general, the American public is cowed and beaten. They are scared of losing their job. They're scared of losing their standing in the community. I'm talking about my generation now. The younger generations, especially say Gen Z, younger than millennials, let's say, they are so economically stressed. They are quite different in thinking like, what have I got to lose? I can't afford an apartment. I can't afford to go to the dentist. I can't afford a college education. As you pointed out, many people go into the military to get a college education. That is how they would explain that. But I feel like because I'm an old white lady, the police are not going to mess me up. I look like somebody who probably has the resources to fight a legal battle if my rights are violated. And many, many people that I know sympathize with us and agree with us are not in that position. They are too vulnerable economically, or because it's a person of color, or because they're very young. So we feel like getting arrested isn't the be all and end all of protest. But, when people say, why do you do it? I'm like, because a lot of people can't do it. They're just not really in a position to do it. So I don't judge people too much for their lack of political understanding. The information control is, 24/7. And most people are raised by parents that teach them, that the nail that sticks up gets hit on the head. Don't be calling attention to yourself or you'll be in trouble. I had parents that were more like, my dad was always telling me things like, oh, government exists so that the poor don't eat the rich. He was just like a middle class, middle manager guy, but he had a lot of radical ideas that he talked about. He also used to tell me garbage collectors should get paid as much as doctors. They definitely contribute to the public health at least as much. And my mother was more famous for, like, if my dad's boss pinched her butt in the buffet line at the Christmas party, she turned around and slapped him and said, keep your hands off me, at the top of her voice. And that was my dad's boss. And my dad, the reason I know about it is my dad would come home and tell us kids about it at the breakfast table the next day. And he thought it was great that she was so willing to stick up for herself. And he would have never said, like, oh, well, don't get me in trouble with my boss. So I was lucky to have those parents. I'm lucky to be Irish American, and there's a strong tradition of rebellion against the empire. So, everybody doesn't have the same experiences and everybody doesn't have the same risks. I'm just trying to do the best I can with what I've got to work with.